Chapter 39. The witching hour had come. An icy wind pushed clouds through the mountain's teeth. It was cold, too cold for snow. The wind cut through cloaks and gloves and made swords stick in their scabbards, made the men shiver at their posts. The clouds looked like phantoms scurrying over the killing fields, and rushing up and over the walls. Thick, wide braziers of coal that were burning all along the walls did nothing to stave off the chill. The heat was carried off and swallowed into the night. Beards froze and muscles stiffened. Officers barked at the men to keep moving, shouting over the familiar scream of the wind. Those high screams were usually the subject of endlessly retold jokes and comparisons to the men's last bedchamber conquests, sometimes done with imitations. Regnus Geyer had never disciplined the men for howling into the winds. It staved off fears, he said. Anywhere else it would be a distraction, would make the men unable to hear invaders, but you couldn't hear a thing at Screaming Winds anyway. No one howled tonight. Tonight those screams seemed ominous, and if the men's hearing was bad, their sight wasn't much better. The swirling, racing clouds were thick enough and obscured the moon and stars so fully that they'd be lucky to see 50 paces out. The archers would only be useful to about that distance anyway, with this wind. It had been Regnus's nemesis. No matter how much the archers trained, shooting into that dim, inconsistent wind, their accuracy never improved much. One or two had an uncanny sense of when the wind would gust and could hit a man-sized target at 60 paces, but that wasn't nearly the advantage a garrison usually got from holding a wall. Solon had taken a position on the opposite side of the first wall from Voss, hoping that if worse came to worse, he'd be able to help the men without Voss's interference. He couldn't hate the boy. Armies were full of men like Leroy Voss. He was a good enough man, better than most. He was just a soldier who needed a commanding officer, and the times had conspired to make him one instead. It was a cruel trick of fate that would probably make Voss be remembered as a bold idiot who'd gotten his men slaughtered, rather than a heroic soldier. The waiting was the worst. Like every soldier, Solon hated the waiting. It was good to be an officer when it came time to wait. You could fill your time encouraging the men to stand strong. It kept you from having the time to worry yourself. Solon thought he saw something through the swirling clouds and darkness. He stiffened, but it was nothing. It's time. Remember, don't look directly at her. He told the men near him. He pulled out the beeswax plugs he'd been rolling in his fingers to warm and jammed one in his ear, then paused. He thought he saw something again, but it wasn't the outline of a man or a horse, but an enormous square. No, it was nothing. Around him, other men were leaning forward, squinting into the darkness. Then his skin began prickling. Like most male mages, Solon had little talent as a seer. The only magic he could usually see was his own. But he could feel magic, especially when it was close, and always when it was used against him. Now he felt as if he had walked outside on a humid day. The magic wasn't intense, but it was everywhere. It was so diffuse that if Dorian hadn't put him so much on edge, he would never have noticed it. Do any of you know how to tie knots well? The soldiers exchanged puzzled looks. Finally, one of them said, I practically grew up on a fishing boat, sir. I reckon I know about every knot there is. Solon grabbed the coil of rope tied to a bucket that the soldiers used to refill the water cisterns at the top of the wall. He cut the bucket free. Tie me up, he said. Sir? The soldier looked at him like he was crazy. Is this how I looked at Dorian? Sorry, my friend. The magic was thickening. Tie me to the wall. Tie me so I can't move. Take my weapons. Aye, sir. I'm a mage, damn it. I'm more susceptible to what she's... Damn it, she's coming. Soldiers were turning, staring at him. Don't look at her. Don't believe what you see. Damn it, man, now. The rest of you, shoot! There was an order more of them were comfortable with. Even if Leroy Voss was angry at them in the morning, the most they'd have to do is go fetch their arrows in the killing grounds before the walls. The former sailor looped the rope around Solon expertly. In moments, Solon's hands were tied behind his back, secured to his feet, and only after that was his cloak bound around him so he wouldn't freeze. Then the man bound him to the winch they used to raise the bucket. Now, a blindfold, and my other earplug, Solon said. The man had bound him facing over the wall. Solon should have told him to make sure he couldn't face her. Hurry, man! But the soldier didn't respond. He was looking over the wall into the darkness, as was everyone else. Alana? The soldier said. Ellie, is that you? His face flushed and his eyes dilated. He threw his cloak off, then he jumped off the wall. He was halfway to the ground before he flailed wildly, suddenly aware, trying to find something to save himself. The rocks broke his body cruelly, and the wind swallowed the sound of his death scream. There was a sudden flurry of arrows as men began obeying Solon's earlier command to start shooting as soon as anything strange happened. The fog billowed, and he saw the vast wagon being drawn forward, surrounded by Caledonian soldiers, pulled by 6 Aurochs. Solon's heart leapt as he saw a dozen Caledonians cut down by the first wave. The Aurochs took several arrows and didn't even falter, but the rain of arrows was slowing. Across the wall, Solon saw men flinging themselves off the wall. Others were shaking their heads, each lost in a private vision, bows held in limp hands. "Don't look, Solon, don't look." "I won't believe it. Just a quick—" The magic roared past him as if he were flying at tremendous speed. And then, calm. He blinked. He was standing in the Hall of Winds. The magnificent jade throne shone green through the waters of Hokoi Bay. Upon the throne sat a woman he barely recognized. Kaede Wariyamo had been 16 when he'd left the islands, though he'd known from the times he had played with her when they were both young that she would be beautiful. Her transformation had made him awkward. She'd reproached him for avoiding her, but he'd had no choice. He knew he had to leave forever, but he'd never been prepared for what the sight of her would do to him. 12 years later she had grown in grace and confidence. If he hadn't known her so well, he never would have seen the slight apprehension in her eyes. Will he still think I'm beautiful? Oh, he did. Her olive skin still glowed. Her black hair poured around her shoulders like a waterfall. Her eyes still gleamed with intelligence and wisdom and mischief. Perhaps there used to be less wisdom there and more mischief, but those lips looked like they still held 3 lifetimes of smiles. And if she had the faint smile lines around her eyes and lips, what a tribute to a life well lived. To him, they were a mark of distinction. His eyes swept over her body, clad in light blue silk nagaki, cut to emphasize the perfection of each curve. Bound at the waist by a narrow belt of gold, the silk looped over one shoulder. Her stomach was still flat, athletic. There was no stretch marks. Kaede had never borne children. His eyes lingered on her exposed breast. Perfect. She was perfect. He was interrupted by her laugh. "Have you been on Midicru so long you've forgotten what breasts look like, my prince?" Solon blushed. After so many years of seeing women treat ordinary parts like they were erotic, and erotic parts like they were ordinary, he was thoroughly confused. I apologize, Your Majesty." Remembering himself, he tried to kneel, but something was interfering with his motion. It didn't matter. All that mattered was before him. He could not take his eyes off her. "You've been a hard man to find, Solon Warion," Kaede said. It's just Solon now." "The Emperor needs you, Solon Warion. I won't make any demands of you besides producing an heir. And if you require rooms for a mistress, it will be arranged. The Empire needs you, Solon, not just for your family, for you. I need you." She looked terrifically fragile, as if the wind would break her. "I want you, Solon. I want you as I've wanted you 12 years ago, and as I wanted you before that. But now I want your strength, your fortitude, your companionship, "My love," Solon said. "You have it, Kaede. I love you. I always have." She lit up, exactly like she had when she was little and he'd given her a special present. "I've missed you," she said. "I've missed you," he said, a lump rising in his throat. "I'm afraid I was never able to explain why I had to leave." She stepped close to him and put a finger on his lips. Her touch sent shock waves through him. His heart thundered against his ribs. Her very scent suffused him. His eyes couldn't find a place to rest as he looked at her. Every beautiful line and curve and color and tone led to another and another. Smiling, she put a hand on his cheek. "Oh, gods, I'm lost." She had that same uncertain, wavering look that she'd had that last day when she kissed him and he'd nearly torn her clothes off. She kissed him and her lips were all the world. She started tentatively, just touching that exquisite softness against his lips, and then drawing him out. She was suddenly aggressive, just as she had been that day, as though her passion had only been building for all the time he was gone. Her body pressed up against him, and he moaned. She broke away from him, breathing hard, her eyes fiery. "Come to my chamber," she said. "This time I swear my mother won't break in on us." She climbed up a tall step and looked at him over her shoulder as she took a few steps away, her hips swaying. She grinned devilishly and brushed the nagaki strap off her shoulder. He tried to step up after her, but he slipped back to his place on the floor. Kaede slipped the gold belt off her waist and dropped it carelessly. Solon strained to climb up that damn step. Something was cutting off his breath. "I'm coming," he said, wheezing. She shimmied, and the nagaki dropped to the floor in a silk puddle. Her body was all bronze curves and shining waterfalls of black hair. He coughed. He couldn't breathe. He'd thrown this away once, and he wasn't going to give it up now. He coughed again and dropped to his knees. Kaede was just down the hall, smiling, the light playing over her lean body, her long, long legs, her slim ankles. He climbed back to his feet and strained against the ropes again. Why is she smiling? Kaede wouldn't smile when he was choking to death. Kaede wouldn't be like this at all. Her mannerisms weren't similar to the girl he had known. They were exactly the same, fitted to an older face. A woman who'd been a queen for 10 years wouldn't let down all the barriers this fast. She was everything he'd hoped or imagined. The real Kaede would be furious with him. The vision disappeared all at once, and Solon was back on the wall. He was staring over the edge, only the ropes keeping him from falling to his death. Around him, men were dying horribly. One's stomach had swollen to 3 times his normal size, and he was still retching into the air, as if shoving food down his throat. Reaching into the air, as if shoving food down his throat. Another was purple, screaming at someone who wasn't there, but he was no longer screaming words. His voice was a wreck, and every once in a while he coughed and blood flew out of his mouth, but he never stopped screaming. Another was shrieking, "Mine! It's mine!" and beating the stone wall with his hands as if they were attacking him. His hands were bloody stumps, ruined. But he never stopped. Others were lying down, dead, with no indication of what had killed them. Many had killed themselves by one means or another, but some had been scorched with magic or exploded. The wall ran red with their already freezing blood. The gate had been blown apart while he had been in his trance, and dark figures were marching toward them now, driving the team of Aurochs, pulling the enormous wagon. It was Kali. Solon had no doubt of that. "Has Dorian gone mad yet?" a woman's voice asked. "That was my little gift, you know." Solon looked but couldn't see the source of the voice. He wasn't sure it wasn't coming from inside his own head. "He's completely cured, actually." She laughed. It was a deep, throaty sound. "So he is alive." Solon wanted to crumple. They thought Dorian was dead, or at least they didn't know. "Let's get this over with," Solon said. She chuckled. "You've been told many lies in your life, Solonwarian. They lied to you when you were growing up. They lied to you at Shosendi. They stole from you. I'm not going to offer you power, because the truth is I can't give you power. The Ver doesn't come from me. That's just another lie. I wish it did. The truth is the Ver is natural, and it's vastly more powerful than your pitiable talent. The truth is Dorian's talent was weak before he used the Ver, and you know how powerful his talent is now. It's enslaving. Meisters are like drunks looking for their next glass of wine." "Some of them, yes. The fact is, some people can't handle drink. But most people can. Maybe you'd be one of the people who can. Or who can't, like Dorian. But I wouldn't bet on that. The truth is, Dorian always liked his special place in the sun, didn't he? He liked having you look up to him, having everyone look up to him. And what would he be without his power? Without his extra gifts? He'd be so much less than you, Solon. Without the Ver, he'd have no gifts, and his talent would be minuscule compared to yours. So where would that put you if you used the Ver? Even if you just used it once, just to unlock the hidden talents you didn't even know you have. What could you do with that kind of power? Could you go back to Seth and make things right? Take your place with Kaede on the throne? Take your place in history?" She shrugged. "I don't know. I don't really care. But you're pathetic, you magi. You can't even use magic in the dark, really." "Lies. It's all lies." Is it? Well, then, you hold on to your weakness, your humility. But if you ever change your mind, Solon Warian, this is all you have to do. The power is there, and it's waiting for you. And then she showed him. It was simple. Instead of reaching toward a source of light, the sun or a fire, or instead of reaching into his Verdant, he just had to reach toward Kali. A little twist, and it was there, an ocean of power, being constantly fed from tens of thousands of sources. Solon couldn't understand it all, but he could see the outlines. Every Caledonian prayed morning and night. The prayer wasn't empty words, it was a spell. It emptied a portion of everyone's Glorverdin into this ocean. Then Callie gave it back to those she willed, when and as much as she wanted. At heart, it was simple. A magical tax. Because so many people were born with a Glorverdin but lacked the capabilities or the teaching to express it, Callie's favorites would always have ample power, and the people would never even know they were being robbed of their very vitality. That didn't explain the verb, but it did explain why the Caledonians had always used pain and torture in their worship. Callie didn't need the suffering, she needed her worshippers to feel intense emotions. Intense emotions were what allowed marginally talented people to use their Glorverdin. Torture was simply the most reliable way to spark emotions of the right intensity. Whether the torturer and tortured and spectators felt disgust, loathing, fear, hatred, lust, or delight made no difference. Callie could use them all. My soulsworn will find you now, and you'll die, Callie said. You emptied your Glorverdin already, didn't you? Begone, he said. She laughed. Oh, you're a good one. I think I'll keep you. Then her voice was gone, and Solon crumpled to the stones. Callie was in Scenaria. The Ursals would make for Raleigh, and the rebels would be massacred. All his service here had been for nothing. All he had just learned was for nothing. He should have gone home to Seth 12 years ago. He'd failed. He opened his eyes and saw one of the soulsworn, draped in heavy sable cloaks, their faces obscured behind blank black masks, picking through the dead along the wall. Now and then one would stop, draw a sword, and dispatch someone. They wiped their swords afterwards so the blood wouldn't freeze their blades to the insides of their scabbards. They were coming toward him. There was nothing he could do. He was bound, and the horizon was barely gray. No weapons, no magic. The Ver was his only way out. Even if it was suicide, at least he could take a lot of them with him. Maybe he could outsmart her, if he could just survive. And how stupid to be killed by some thug in a costume. He could fight Kali. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't a goddess. He talked to her. He understood her. He could fight her. He just needed the power to do it. Solon's heart thudded in his chest. It was exactly what Dorian had said he himself would be tempted to do. Solon had thought the temptation had stopped, but this was the last one, the hardest one. Dorian was right. He'd been right about everything. Oh, God. Sir, if you are there, I despise myself for praying now when I've got nothing to lose but shit. If you just help me live through... Solon's prayer was interrupted as a heavy corpse fell on him. Solon opened his mouth and took a deep breath. He was just exhaling when warm blood from the corpse poured into his mouth. It was metallic and already thickening. He almost threw up as the blood spilled over his chin, down his neck, through his beard, but he froze as he heard a foot scuff on the stone nearby. The soulsworn pulled the body off him, but didn't walk away. Look at this one, Cav, he said, with a thick Caledonian accent. Another screamer? Love it when they do that, a second voice said. Must have pissed off the men, huh? Must have been one of the first to go if they tied him up like that. The first soulsworn stepped close and bent over Solon. Solon could hear the man's breathing hissing through the mask over his face. The man stood and kicked Solon in the kidney. Pain lanced through him, but he didn't make a sound. The man kicked him again and again. The third time, Solon's body betrayed him, and he tensed his muscles. It was just too hard to lie limp. He's still alive, the man said. Kill him! Solon's heart leapt into his throat. It was over. He had to grab the Ver and die. Wait. The thought was so calm, so simple and clear, that it seemed to come from outside of him. Solon held still. The second I hear steel, I'll... He didn't know. He'd take the Ver, then Kali would have him. The other man grunted. Shit, my blade's frozen. Could have swore I got it cleaned off." "Ah, forget it. Between the cold and the bleeding, he'd be dead in 5 minutes. If he could have got out of the ropes, he would have when she came through." And they walked away.